Welcome to the St. Thomas More Lynchburg's Homily Podcast. We join Father John Christian as he brings his insight and application to the readings for the third Sunday of Advent.
It has always been beneficial to reflect on and consider the colors that the Church uses throughout the liturgical year. Today is one of only two instances throughout the entire year that we use the color described as rose. And it's interesting to think about the meanings that are given to these colors. For if we think of the color traditionally used with funerals, black was the color of praying for another. Violet was the color of praying for oneself, hence its use as a penitential color. White, of course, being a celebratory color. So the notion of rose was a color that was designated to use for joy, but subdued joy. Not the full depth of violet that we're accustomed to with Advent and Lent, but just like in Lent, where we have that one Sunday, Laetare Sunday, so too in Advent do we have this one Sunday where we're to call to mind the great joy that marks the Christian. We call it Gaudete Sunday simply from the opening word of the antiphon that would traditionally start this Mass, where it went, Gaudete Christus est natus ex Maria Virgine, rejoice, Christ is born of the Virgin Mary. And so this Sunday has come to be known as Gaudete Sunday, a Sunday where in the midst of this penitential season of preparation and expectation, we pause to reflect on the joy that the Christian is called to, the joy that the Christian is exhorted to, the joy that the Christian is to possess. And joy is an interesting thing, for we do indeed make a distinction between joy and happiness. While happiness is by no means a bad thing, it is essentially a feeling and is the result of happenstance. Something could occur or happen whereby we are made happy by it, which again, there's nothing wrong with, but that happiness can often be fleeting. Joy, on the other hand, is something that often abides and is much more all-encompassing. I think of the examples of the great saints, many of whom lived in very unhappy circumstances. If we consider the asceticism of Saint Francis of Assisi, who endured cold and hardship and hunger, yet was always joyful. Or if we consider the witness of other religious, as I'm reminded of the missionaries of charity. Several years ago, seemingly even more now at this point, back when I was in seminary in Baltimore, part of the formation and education at that time was seminarians were sent out to various institutions throughout the city for what was called an apostolate. This would take the form of perhaps a soup kitchen or after-school tutoring or some other work of charity. And the one that I happened to be assigned to was called Gift of Hope. And it was down in a particularly blighted neighborhood of Baltimore. And it was a men's AIDS hospice, and it was run by the missionaries of charity, the sisters of course, Saint Teresa of Calcutta. And one thing that I found particularly moving and striking about these sisters was, in spite of their kind of demure demeanor, they had absolute backbones of iron. These were spiritually the toughest people I'd ever encountered in my life. To watch these little women go about their task, and when I say little, I mean truly diminutive. Not a one of them stood 5 feet. They had all come from far off places. Most of them came from various parts of the Indian subcontinent and had been called there to Baltimore to witness to people that didn't look like them, that didn't share a culture, shared nothing but a common humanity. And yet these sisters made it their task, their mission, their vocation to minister to these men whose difficult lives had brought them to an increasingly difficult end. And so these sisters would go about the task of catechizing many of them. Through their joy in the witness, many of the residents of that hospice came to embrace the faith and be baptized. And one of the things that I learned about the missionaries of charity that I didn't quite fully grasp, and maybe those of you who are familiar with them knew this already, but in addition to the 3 vows that all religious take, poverty, chastity, and obedience, Mother Teresa required of her sisters a 4th vow, a vow of joyfulness. She required that her sisters who were entering into this community with her exhibit always and everywhere Christian joy. And through that witness, It was truly inspiring and truly something to see many of these people who had had very difficult lives here at the end, through the witness of these sisters, learn the faith and accept that joy of the faith into their own hearts as they ultimately prepared for their own death. They would often use the Baltimore Catechism and all those wonderful pictures that were in it. And I remember watching the sisters as they'd go through the donation bin. They'd pull out dress shirts, ties, suits, and shoes, and would press them, steam them, iron them, and shine the shoes so that these men would have dignified clothes to be buried in preparation for their funerals. It was something, well, there is a tragedy on the one hand, there is an extreme beauty to see how these sisters looked after these men who were dying and in great and tremendous pain. But the joyfulness that they exhibited brought many, I dare say, I believe it was most of them, into the faith. Many were baptized. Many were given Christian burial. And it's a poignant reminder of just how powerful joy can truly be. And as she required of her sisters, Mother Teresa required of them to be joyful, it shows us that joy isn't something that is just happenstance, like happiness, but rather something that to a certain extent can be chosen and has a different source. For instance, joy can come from God. It comes from the sure and certain knowledge of God's love and mercy for each of us. And so, therefore, it can also be something that is obstructed. And so for us as Christians on this Gaudete Sunday, it's good for us to ask, just as we heard in the Gospels, what is it in our life that's in the way of our Christian joy? The tax collectors came before John the Baptist and asked him, what is it that we are to do? And he tells them, collect only what is prescribed. The soldiers come to him and they ask, what is it that we are to do? And he tells them to not extort anyone. Don't falsely accuse. Be satisfied with your wages. And so each and every one of us does well to ask that question, what is it that I am to do? What thing, person, situation, whatever it is, what has gotten between me and that Christian joy? For the Christian is truly capable of being joyful when in grace, when living in cooperation with God's will and living in his grace administered to us through the sacraments and available to us through his love. And so then on this Gaudete Sunday, let us all challenge ourselves in the midst of this season of expectation and ask ourselves, well, what is it that John the Baptist would recommend of us if I were to come forward and say, what is it that I am to do? So that all of us, each and every one, might be properly disposed and prepared and readied to welcome the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ at this imminent Christmas celebration.
Thank you for tuning in to the St. Thomas More Lynchburg's Homily Podcast. For the daily reading and to learn more about the community of St. Thomas More, please visit our website at www.stmva.org. If you were blessed by our podcast today, please give it a like, a kind review, and share it with a friend. God bless.